Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by congratulating TC322 for having this plenary meeting and thanking Peter for taking the great leadership in the past few years, which took TC322 to become a global platform for hosting and developing sustainable finance standards. And also a big welcome to Paul, who is now taking over from Peter as the interim chairman of this committee. As I'm wearing a number of hats from international networks on sustainable finance, I'd like to give you a quick update on what's happening in the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, the NGFS, namely the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, and IPSF, namely the International Platform for Sustainable Finance. I think all these works are highly relevant to TC322. Starting with G20, as you know, China initiated this G20 Green Finance study group in 2016, when China was the presidency of G20. This study group reached the consensus on the need to scale up green finance globally. Last year, during Italian presidency, the study group was upgraded to a working group. So it's now called the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. And I continue to co-chair this group on behalf of China. Last year, the main achievement of the working group was the release of the G20 Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which will guide the international work on sustainable finance in the coming few years. Let me give you 4 highlights of this roadmap, which I believe will help shape the future direction of sustainable finance globally. Number 1, given the backdrop that there are too many different standards, principles, and frameworks trying to define what is green and sustainable, the G20 roadmap highlighted the need and proposed some actions to improve comparability and interoperability of sustainable finance taxonomies. Number 2, the G20 endorsed the launch of ISSB, namely International Sustainability Standard Board, which will develop a set of internationally consistent reporting standards on sustainability-related information. Again, the purpose of this is to overcome the problem of lack of global coordination towards disclosure. Number 3, the G20 roadmap stated that the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group will work with other IOs to develop a framework for transition finance to enhance the ability of the global financial system to mobilize finance for carbon-intensive sectors to transit towards net zero. This is actually the major task for this year's G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. This year, we will publish the high-level principle for transition finance framework, which should include 5 key elements. These are identification of transition activities, disclosure or reporting, policy incentives, and measure to ensure just transition. Number 4, the G20 roadmap stated in several places that over the medium term, the sustainable finance framework, including taxonomy, disclosure, and risk analysis, should go beyond climate and cover other issues on sustainability, especially nature and biodiversity. Now, let me move on to the NGFS. Recently, I chaired the research workstream of the NGFS, which has focused on a study on how central banks and the regulators can play a role in protecting nature and biodiversity, which in turn would help protect financial stability. We launched a study group between NGFS and Inspire, co-chaired by myself and Professor Nick Robin, on the topic of biodiversity and financial stability. We just produced the final report on March 24th, which is a little more than a month ago, and the report is now on the NGFS website. For the first time in history, we presented this collective view from NGFS, which is biodiversity loss will become a threat to financial stability, and therefore, central banks and supervisors should take actions to guard against this risk. I think this new consensus has historical implications, which is similar to the view formed 5-6 years ago when central banks and supervisors began to realize that climate change was a source of financial risk. Our biodiversity study has made a few recommendations for specific actions from central banks and the supervisors. Number 1, be aware of biodiversity-related financial risk. Number 2, build capacity to analyze this risk. Number 3, measure exposure of your financial system to this risk. Number 4, take actions to mitigate these risks, and number 5, mobilize financing to protect the nature and biodiversity. Going forward, I expect many central banks and supervisors will begin to take actions, for example, to require financial institutions to assess the impact of the investment on biodiversity, to assess the financial risks arising from biodiversity loss, to disclose such information, to include nature positive activities into sustainable finance taxonomies, and to introduce policy instruments to incentivize nature positive investments. Now, finally, I'd like to say a few words on the common ground taxonomy developed by the IPSF. As many of you know, the EU, China, and a dozen other jurisdictions launched the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, or IPSF, in 2019. Under the IPSF, a working group was set up to develop a common ground taxonomy based on the EU and Chinese taxonomies. The purpose of this work is to find ways to improve the comparability and interoperability of taxonomies used in major markets. I had an honor to co-chair this group on behalf of China, together with Basel Haq representing EU. After nearly 2 years of work, the working group produced the first version of the common ground taxonomy in November last year, and that version includes 55 climate mitigation activities that are recognized by both the EU and Chinese taxonomies. The second version is almost ready and will soon be published. It should include more than 70 activities. This common ground taxonomy can be used in several ways. First, other jurisdictions can use this common ground taxonomy as a reference or basis for developing their own taxonomies. Just a few days ago, Sri Lanka published its first green finance taxonomy, and a key building block of the Sri Lanka taxonomy is a common ground taxonomy. Second, issuers can use the common ground taxonomy to issue green bonds or other green securities in the international markets. This was done by China Construction Bank a couple of months ago, and many other Chinese issuers are now in the process of preparing similar issuance using common ground taxonomy as a label. By using common ground taxonomy, issuers can avoid duplication of verifications, and transactions are much easier to be understood by international investors. Simply put, the common ground taxonomy can facilitate cross-border green capital flows. To conclude, the international communities and many jurisdictions are busy working on various initiatives for advancing sustainable finance. But we are facing a problem. That is, a large number of standards, frameworks, and principles are being developed without sufficient coordination. And this may lead to market segmentation, confusion, and high transaction costs. The future direction of global standards development is to improve the comparability, interoperability, and eventually to achieve consistency and harmonization. TC 322, as an international body dedicated to sustainable finance standards, should play a key role in this regard. Thank you very much for listening, and I wish today's conference a great success.